Welcome to Creation Update. My name is Ken Samples, and today we're going to be exploring the interface between science and the Christian faith. This is an interactive program. In the second hour, we'll be taking your telephone calls. I'm joined in studio today by three of the RTB Scholar team. First of all, Dr. Hugh Ross. Hi, Hugh.
Hello there.
It's good to have you. We also have Dr. David Rogstad. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Ken. Good to be here.
Good to have you. And also our astrophysicist, Jeff Swearink.
Hi, Ken. Good to be here today.
Well, today we have a special program. We have a special guest that we're going to introduce here in just a minute. In fact, all of our listeners, I'm sure, will know him. It's Dr. William Lane Craig. Dr. Craig serves as research professor of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology, my old alma mater there. And Dr. Craig has written numerous books, many scholarly but also popular books. In fact, the third edition of his signature book, Reasonable Faith, has just been released by Crossway Books. And we're glad to have him. Dr. Craig.
Good to be with you.
Well, we've been looking forward to having you. We have lots of questions about philosophy and theology and science, and you're very kind to be with us.
Oh, not at all. Glad to.
Well, let's begin a little bit with your article in Christianity Today in the July 2008 issue. You had the cover article entitled "God is Not Dead Yet." And I'd like to begin by asking you a question about that article. In the article, you talk a little bit about a revolution in Anglo-American philosophy and, in fact, a renaissance in Christian philosophy. And, in fact, you say this. You say, quote, "Atheism, though perhaps still the dominant viewpoint at the American university, is a philosophy in retreat." I wonder if you'd tell us a little bit about that.
Well, when you look at the long picture of Anglo-American philosophy going back into the last century, back in the 30s and 40s, it was very dark indeed for religious believers. The predominant attitude among professional philosophers at that time was the talk about God, since it can't be verified by the five senses, is literally meaningless. It doesn't even have the dignity of being false. It's just unintelligible sounds coming out of your mouth when you utter a sentence with the word God in it. And so there was very little Christian philosophy that was on the radar screen at all. There may have been a few Christian philosophers, but they certainly weren't doing Christian philosophy in any sort of a prominent or public way. And all of that began to change in the late 1960s. Usually people date the revolution to the publication of the book God and Other Minds by Alvin Plantinga, which showed that a person approaching these subjects from a Christian or theistic point of view could do so with the same sort of originality, analytic precision, brilliance, and logical care that naturalistic philosophers were exhibiting. And following in Plantinga's train has come a host of other Christian philosophers and theistic philosophers that are now reading papers in the best professional societies, publishing in the peer-reviewed journals, publishing books with the top academic presses, so that the whole face of Anglo-American philosophy has been changed as a result. Now, as I say, the majority view at the university may still be atheism or agnosticism, but compared to the way it was in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, it's like night and day.
Now, do you see this spreading beyond the Anglo-American philosophical milieu?
I do see this slowly beginning to happen. In fact, in other English-speaking countries like New Zealand and Australia, for example, where I was earlier this year, we begin to see the first glimmers of this kind of revolution starting to hit those shores as well. I was in New Zealand for a professional philosophy conference at Victoria University in Wellington, which was sponsored by this very secular Department of Philosophy on the subject of Molinism, which is a viewpoint having to do with a theory of God's knowledge. And they brought in Christian philosophers from the United States to confer with Australian and New Zealand philosophers on this subject of Molinism because of its intrinsic philosophical interest. So I was tremendously encouraged to see this beginning to hit there. This month, I'm going off to Germany to a conference at Humboldt University in Berlin on the subject of God and time. And this is also bringing American Christian philosophers to Europe, to Germany in this case, to have a collaboration with German philosophers on the subject of divine eternity and how we understand God's relationship to time. So there again, we're beginning to see the flickers of this fire that I hope we can fan into a bright burning flame in these other countries as well.
Now, Dr. Craig, one of the things I enjoyed most about your Christianity Today article is here at Reasons to Believe, Dr. Ross talks a lot about new reasons for faith. My training is in philosophy. I like the traditional arguments. But would you agree with me that Big Bang cosmology and the fine-tuning ideas of the universe have really kind of served to revitalize those traditional arguments? So, you know, the cosmological, teleological arguments get quite a boost from modern cosmology.
Absolutely. I'm very amused when I hear atheists say, oh, these arguments are just retreads of the same old medieval arguments for God's existence that have been endlessly refuted. I think these fellows don't know what they're talking about. There wasn't any knowledge of the expanding universe prior to the 1920s, and the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life was a discovery in the second half of the 20th century. So the idea that these are just warmed-over arguments that have been refuted is just based on ignorance of what's currently happening in science. So I think you're absolutely right that these scientific discoveries breathe new life into these ancient arguments.
You know, one of the things I found interesting, not just on the scientific argument you made with the cosmological argument, but it seemed like, as you were talking about the moral argument, the ontological argument, that, there are various premises in these arguments that, and you seem to be repeatedly making the comment. Now, you might think this is the controversial one, but this is well accepted. For example, premise 2 of the moral argument that objective moral values and duties duties do exist. You're making the statement that out in the philosophical realm, that's an uncontroversial statement. Do you find that to be the norm, that what seems to be these things that support the Christian worldview are becoming more and more accepted, or I guess what are you trying to get at there?
I'm not sure about that, whether or not they're more and more accepted, but it certainly is true that where the undergraduate thinks the argument is weak is not the place to attack the argument. That they're usually unaware that, for example, the second premise that objective moral values and duties exist is widely accepted by secular philosophers and ethicists today. And in the scores of debates that I've had with non-theists on university campuses, that premise is almost never disputed by a professional philosopher, because they realize that any argument against the objectivity of moral values will be based on premises that are less obvious than the existence of objective moral values and duties themselves. And you can't use the less obvious to deny the more obvious. So that isn't what the undergraduate might think. He might think that's the weak point. Or in the ontological argument, again, they might think that some of these premises are in doubt, when in fact it's really the first premise is where the whole debate lies. If you grant that first premise that God's existence is even possible, then the rest of the argument just follows almost uncontroversially.
Dr. Craig, go ahead, Jeff.
Well, I was just going to ask, is that a statement, is that just a reflection of how much philosophical work has been advanced over the last 30, 40, 50 years, that what the undergraduate sees is not what's going on in the kind of more advanced philosophical arenas?
That's a good point. I hadn't thought of this, but in the same way I described this revolution in, or the impact of these scientific discoveries and the demise of verificationism, that would also apply to these other arguments, because it wasn't just theological statements that these verificationists dismissed as meaningless. Also, ethical statements were dismissed as meaningless nonsense. And so the fact that the wide majority of philosophers today would say that these ethical statements are objectively true would represent just a huge change, a huge sea change from the 30s and 40s, when these were dismissed as meaningless. And similarly, the advances in the ontological argument that we just have been speaking about would largely be a product of advances in modal logic that have been made in recent decades that weren't available to philosophers prior to the 60s. So, although the arguments themselves are old, they've been just revolutionized by more recent developments.
How does this all fit in the context of the popular view as characterized by people like Dawkins and Kitchings and others, that atheism is on the rise and that the demise of religion is just around the corner?
Yeah, they're so out of touch. I know that sounds cocky, but it really is true. They are just out of touch with where the contemporary discussion is. And the way you can prove this, if challenged, is to say, look at their footnotes. You can tell from their footnotes they are not citing the best in the current literature. Mm-hmm. And that is proof positive that they're out of touch with the key thinkers and movements in these areas.
I sat in a talk here by Dawkins at Caltech campus. Now it's probably 6 or 8 months ago, where he was giving a talk on his book. And, the place was jammed with more than 1,000 people. And every statement he made, which in my view was of this kind that you're talking about, indicating really being out of touch. You had all of these 1,000 people cheering and enthusiastically supporting what he was saying. It just seems like the popular view is more of his kind rather than of what the philosophers in the secular or college departments are saying.
Yeah, it's very discouraging when you go to one of these pep rallies mm-hmm. where all of the atheists gather to cheer on these fellows like heroes. It can be very, very disturbing, and this happens on other campuses too. I do think that these people do represent a kind of cadre that follow him, the sort of groupies, if you will, rather than the general university student population as a whole. And I think you know that as well from your experience speaking on university campuses, that thousands will also come out to hear an honest presentation of the evidence for God or Jesus Christ and listen with a real interest and an open mind. So although it is disheartening to see so many deceived by this shoddy scholarship, I don't think that they represent the majority by any means.
Dr. Craig, I wonder if you could touch upon naturalism, maybe two different kind of ideas here. One of our favorite lunchroom discussions is about the argument from reason. And as you well know, a number of authors have been arguing that the naturalistic worldview has difficulty making sense of human rationality, that if our cognitive faculties have evolved from purely naturalistic processes, can we trust them to give us truth about reality? What's your take on that argument from reason? Do you think that there is real substance to this?
Well, I find it persuasive. Alvin Planting is the one who has developed this in the greatest degree of detail. And what he argues is that given an evolutionary account of human cognitive faculties, there's no reason to think that it's probable that those faculties are reliable, because you can show that there are many ways in which they could have survival value and therefore be selected for survival, which would be quite independent of their truth. So that if, as the evolutionary story claims, our cognitive faculties are selected for survivability rather than for truth conduciveness, we can have no confidence whatsoever that our beliefs are true. But if that's the case, then naturalism is self-defeating, because it's by using those very cognitive faculties that the naturalist has come to believe naturalism. but he can have no confidence in the deliverances of those cognitive faculties, including the conclusion that naturalism is true. So Plantinga's argument is that naturalism has a kind of intrinsic, built-in defeater, where if it's true, it would never be rational to believe in it.
Now, Dan Dennett, one of the four horsemen of the new atheism, he has even said that belief in God or belief in immortality or objective moral values, that these were beliefs produced by the evolutionary process because it promoted survivability. That seems to really make Plantinga's point that beliefs that are false do more to promote survivability than maybe true beliefs.
Well, yeah, that could be illustrative of the point, isn't it? That if these beliefs are selected for their survival value rather than their truth, then that could be the case for all of our cognitions, as Plantinga shows. So it's a really serious problem, one that troubled Darwin himself, by the way, as I'm sure you know.
Yes.
But now has been developed with a great deal of more sophistication by Plantinga.
Just a comment about that. I read Plantinga's article in the Christianity Today with great interest in
Books and culture.
Yeah, because
Right.
I have discussions like this with an atheist at JPL that's a friend of mine over the years, and this friend is not terribly convinced that that selection for survivability doesn't include, at least to some degree, the truth of certain beliefs. I mean, there's certain beliefs that clearly, some of the things that he gives in his article is the idea that, believing that tigers are some little kitty cats that you can go and pet is not a correct belief, and that belief will be selected against. And so I get into this tension of how do you convince a person of this idea that survivability doesn't select in favor of the truth of a statement, when you can certainly think of examples where the truth is very important, the truth of a belief.
Well, I think what would be important would be to look at Plantinga's more detailed account of this, where he lists something like 5 different ways in which beliefs can be conducive to survival independent of their truth value. And as long as that's the case, you would never have any reason for knowing which one of those 5 you're in. So that while having truth-conducive beliefs may incline to survival in some cases, you couldn't know that you're in a case like that. One illustration, I think, that makes Plantinga's case very persuasive is that on the naturalistic, materialistic view of human beings, the mind, or our set of beliefs, has no causal influence on our bodies. Everything is materialistically determined, so that the causal connections between brain and mind are all one way. They're from the brain to the mind. But the mind as an immaterial entity or soul doesn't exist on naturalism, and so doesn't exert any causal influence over the brain or the central nervous system. Well, now, if that's the case, then it seems to me it just becomes obvious that the truth of these beliefs can have no causal impact whatsoever on the organism. The truth of the beliefs just kind of float along like a sort of epiphenomenon that is the product of brain states. And as long as those brain states that are produced are conducive to survival, the propositional content of the beliefs is just irrelevant, because there is no causal connection or causal influence running from the mind and its belief states to the brain and the organism.
I guess I had a question on, or one of the, as Ken's mentioned, we've discussed this quite a bit at lunch, and not being the philosopher, that sounds a pretty devastating argument, that if you can't trust the inferences you draw from your brain to give you any sort of statement of truth, then you can't know that naturalism is true. At least if naturalism were indeed true. How do naturalists respond to that? I mean, what are the philosophical rebuttals, and do they carry any weight, or how strong are they?
Well, I haven't followed this debate all that closely myself because this isn't one of the arguments that I traditionally defend in my own work, so I followed this on the side. But I think that the typical response is the one that Hugh's friend gave by saying that if your beliefs are true, then this will have survival value. So that by aiming at survival, it's probable that you'll have true beliefs because the true ones are the ones that will be conducive to survival. But then, as I said, the difficulty is that Plantinga gives about 5 different scenarios in which that's not the case, that you can have survival-conducive beliefs that don't need to be true. And so you don't know that you're in that situation of having true beliefs that are conducive to survival.
I think what my friend would argue is this is actually
This is Dave Rogstad.
This is Dave Rogstad.
Identify so Bill knows who you are.
Yeah, this wasn't Hugh, it was Dave. What my friend would argue is that while that may be true of some beliefs, that somehow the evolutionary process in being able to bring about the truth of some beliefs will develop a mechanism within the physiological system within the human being that will then produce a broader range of beliefs and maybe even bring about beliefs that while true are not necessarily directly connected with survivability. This is a lot of wishy-washy kind of talk. I grant you.
That sounds just like hand-waving to me.
Well, it is, but a lot of this stuff is that way.
How can you have any confidence that has in fact happened when we can have all sorts of beliefs that would be conducive to survival, and that's all that evolution cares about. It doesn't care about the truth. So how do you know that you're in that situation? It seems to me that that's just by faith.
Well, I need to read Plantinga's book, I guess, where he discusses
It's on my
this
shelf
more
upstairs.
Okay, we'll have to get that.
It's a good book.
Let's move ahead just a little bit. Dr. Craig, I wonder if I could ask you a little bit more about naturalism. And here you wrote an article about the theological metaethical foundations, and I thought you put a point here that's very fascinating that I think our scientists can relate to, that, if I'm going to die and humanity collectively is going to die and the universe is going to grow cold due to entropy, is there anything that any of us can think or do that will change that scenario? And if not, how does naturalism escape some sense of hopelessness?
There isn't anything that can be done. Freeman Dyson tried to suggest that perhaps there would be ways to avert thermodynamic extinction someday, but it's generally agreed that this is fanciful thinking, that it's really futile, so that ultimately everything in the universe and in human existence, all our accomplishments will be undone in the disintegration of the material universe around us. And I frankly don't see how a sense of hopelessness can be avoided. It seems to me that it leads to just utter despair and meaninglessness because nothing really matters. It all ends up the same.
Well, you can put it this way. If human hope is real, then there's got to be something beyond this universe.
Yes, that would be the kind of reverse way of putting it, wouldn't it? That if there is no God, then ultimately there is no hope. So if there is real hope, then there has to be some sort of a transcendent ground for it, beyond the universe, beyond the laws of thermodynamics.
That seems to kind of go back to our argument from reason, is that here's this hope, which seems to be a pretty, I think you could make a good argument is helpful for our survival, but yet in a naturalist perspective, there is no ultimate hope.
No ground for it.
It's a false positive. Dr. Craig, I know your father and my father were involved in the Second World War. I have a question in light of naturalism. If God doesn't exist, is there any objective moral reason why Hitler shouldn't have murdered the Jews? That is Dostoevsky correct that if God doesn't exist, all things are permissible?
Well, that is a hard saying, isn't it? It's hard to swallow to admit that, but it does seem to me that that is the consequence of atheism, that if there is no God, then all things are permitted. Because on the atheistic view, we're just animals. We're just relatively advanced primates, and there is no reason to think that the herd morality that has evolved among Homo sapiens on this planet that's conducive to our survival is objectively true. So animals aren't moral agents. When a lion kills a zebra, it kills the zebra, but it doesn't murder the zebra. Or when a hyena takes some of the prey from the lion, it takes the prey, but it doesn't steal the prey, because none of these actions have any moral dimensions to them. And it seems to me on naturalism, we're in exactly the same boat. We're just animals, and our illusions of moral worth and moral duty are just that, mere human delusions.
Now, how do you respond to the person who...
This is Dave again.
Yeah, that's Dave again. Again, my friend and I have these kinds of discussions. And he, of course, wants to respond by saying, well, these things have evolved. Sort of a social conscience has come about through an evolutionary process where, the survival of the group somehow helps the survival of the individual. And so all of these things have kind of worked out. How do you respond to that?
Well, I say that's exactly my point. That is my point that I'm making, that in the absence of God, what we call moral values and duties are just the products of the socio-biological evolutionary process. In the same way that a troop of baboons will exhibit altruistic behavior because it's beneficial for the perpetuation of the species, so among human beings there has evolved this sort of herd morality that is useful in the perpetuation of our species. But there's no reason to think that this morality is objectively true. If you reran the film of evolution, a very different creature with a different set of moral values might have evolved in our place, and there's no reason to think that our morality is objectively true. It's just an illusion that's been fobbed upon us by the evolutionary process.
But
so I think that we want to agree with these people and quote folks like Richard Dawkins and others who say exactly this.
But he would use that as the grounds for saying that Hitler was wrong in doing what he was doing.
Yeah, well, that's where he's inconsistent. All he can say is that Hitler is doing something that goes against the evolutionary process, but he can't make any objective judgment
that's
that
true.
Hitler is doing something that's objectively wrong.
Right.
Now, one point, Dr. Craig, you raised that Hugh and I appreciated in the Christianity Today piece is that you seem to believe that maybe some of us have overcalled the influence of postmodernism in our culture. What's at stake in maybe adopting a Christian postmodernism? Does it have apologetic implications?
Or to be more...
I think it has profound implications for our culture, and that's why I am so concerned about this misdiagnosis of our cultural situation and the challenge we face. If I'm correct that our culture remains at heart deeply modernist and deeply committed to scientific naturalism, then to lay down our best weapons of argument and evidence and rationality and turning instead to just sharing our narrative and inviting people to participate in it will be suicidal for the Christian faith, because it will mean that scientific naturalism will shape the future generation's view of the way reality really is, and Christianity will be reduced to nothing but mythology and just a sort of subjective story that you put on reality, but it has no objective truth or validity to it. And that will just remove any sort of conviction on the part of the populace at large that Christianity is objectively true. So this is a very important issue, I think.
Bill, this is Hugh speaking. You actually make a stronger statement in your article that postmodernism is an impossibility. Can you back that up?
Yes. I think the illustration I use in the article is that nobody is a postmodernist when it comes to taking medicine for a headache. If you got a headache, you better believe there's an objective difference between the label on a medicine bottle and the label on a box of rat poison. You believe the texts have objective meaning. So the idea that we live in a postmodern culture is just a myth. Such a culture would be an impossibility because you couldn't function. Bridges collapsing in Minnesota, for example. That's the kind of thing that would happen in a postmodern culture where there aren't objective principles of engineering and science that require certain structures and strengths to support the weight of a bridge and the traffic. You can't have a postmodern culture that denies the objectivity of truth and the objective properties of the physical world.
Or as we say here, you won't find postmodernists in the mathematics department or the physics department. You got to go to the sociology department to find them.
Yep, that's right. Or sadly, the religious studies department.
Yeah.
There you go.
Dr. Craig, one of the areas we want to touch on a little bit is the issue of middle knowledge. The 16th century Spanish Jesuit theologian and philosopher Luis de Molina developed this middle knowledge position. I wonder if you could kind of briefly summarize what that's about and maybe let us ask you a few questions.
Or, Bill, this is Hugh. As I've been around the country, I've heard 6 different opinions on what you believe about middle knowledge. And I think it'd be helpful to hear from the horse's mouth what the different nuanced positions are on Molinism and middle knowledge.
You would think I could be more clear, wouldn't you? All right, well, let me start off by trying to give a real simple account of it, and then we can unfold it as you want to. But the basic idea that Molina developed here was, frankly, in reaction to Calvin and Luther, the Protestant reformers who denied human freedom and he thought turned human beings into puppets, basically. And Molina wanted to enunciate a view of God's sovereignty and providence that would not obliterate human freedom. And so this is the theory he developed. He argued that God, being all-knowing, knows what every person he could possibly create would freely do in any circumstances that God might possibly put that person in. So he knew, for example, what Hugh Ross would have done if he had been the procurator of Judea during the time of Jesus and Christ was brought before him. He knew what Judas would have done if he had been living in the 20th century and nominated for the presidential election of the United States in 1964. God knows what every possible person would freely do in any possible circumstance that he might place him in. Then, by choosing to create a certain set of persons in certain circumstances, God knows exactly what they will freely do. And so God is able to direct a world of free creatures toward his ends without obliterating their freedom by knowing how they would freely behave in whatever circumstances God puts them in. That's the simple explanation.
Now, Reformed theologians, as well as even some Thomists, have been critical of middle knowledge. Norman Geisler, I know a friend of yours and a friend of ours, he's critical of middle knowledge, and he argues that middle knowledge tends to make God's knowledge contingent. God kind of ends up as an epistemological observer, and then God is not the ultimate determiner, but he is a causal agent. How do you respond to some of those types of criticisms? Do you think there's any validity?
I suppose I would say that it is correct that on this view, God's knowledge is contingent because these truths about how people would freely behave in different circumstances are contingent truths. But I would say that a lot of God's knowledge is contingent. It's contingent that he knows that I'm talking to you on the telephone right now. That's not a necessary truth. There are possible worlds where that never happens. There are possible worlds where I never even exist. So a lot of God's knowledge is contingent in that sense. If you say that everything that God knows, he knows necessarily, that leads to logical fatalism. There's only one possible world, and that seems to be absurd. That would lead not just to determinism, but to utter fatalism.
Now, let's. I found your point interesting that Molina is in many respects responding to the Continental Reformation, if you will.
Right.
Luther and Calvin had very strong views about election, about the fallen nature of man. I know that you would kind of classify yourself more on the Wesleyan Arminian side of the theological divisions within Christendom.
Yes.
How do you deal with those passages and that theological tradition of Augustine, Luther, Calvin, who would argue that sin has put us in bondage?
In fact, before you answer it, let me just give a little more context. I happen to, right at this moment in time, be reading Luther's Bondage of the Will, a very extensive book that takes quite a long time to read through. And, the theme that he seems to be recurring through there is not that will in principle is in bondage, but because of sin, because of what has happened in the fall, that this, we're subject to the sin and unable then to do the kind of good that would bring about our salvation. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the context of at least my position here as I listen to your answer.
And that's Dave Rogstad again.
Yeah. What I would say is that on a Wesleyan point of view, we would agree that natural man left to himself apart from the grace of God would never seek God, would never respond to spiritual things, that it requires a prevenient work of the Holy Spirit. That is to say, a work of the Holy Spirit to convict and draw that person to God himself prior to that person's exercise of faith to receive Christ and become a regenerate Christian. So there's no question, I think, that you have to have the initiative with God. I think where the difference would lie would be with regard to whether or not this grace of God is irresistible. Mm-hmm. Calvin and Luther would say that it's irresistible grace, whereas the Molinist and Arminian would say the grace is not irresistible. At some point, God allows the person freedom to either accept his grace or to reject it and say no further.
Let me pick up on a point there. Augustine was fond of saying that reason doesn't cause faith, but reason everywhere supports faith. Do you agree with that essential point of view? That is that if I pick up reasonable faith and read your cogent arguments, it's not the arguments in and of themselves apart from grace, that there's something more than just an intellectual process going on?
Well, I've already said that apart from the work of the Holy Spirit, the natural man would never respond to the things of God. The arguments would fall like water on a stone. Mm-hmm. So the Holy Spirit has to be at work in convicting and drawing people to himself. I think the mistake, though, of those who don't see reason as a vital part of this is that they fail to realize that the Holy Spirit uses means. That's the key thing to understand. The Holy Spirit uses means of bringing people to himself. One of the means can be preaching, right. But another of the means can be argumentation and evidence. And we trust the Holy Spirit when we present these arguments and evidence to use them as instruments in helping to draw the unbeliever to himself.
Well, one second-hand report, this is Hugh, that I've heard of what you believe about mental knowledge, is that you take the position that God is in total control. Nothing happens outside of his will. Whatever he wants does take place, but that God does it through having total control over the circumstances rather than the will of the individual. Is that accurate, or does that need to be nuanced a little bit?
Well, I think that is accurate, so long as we understand that I don't think that it means God is able to bring about a perfect world. In other words, God doesn't will that someone sin. He doesn't put a person in circumstances willing that that person sin. God's will for every moral agent in whatever situation he finds himself is that that person would do the right thing. But God knows that some people will not do the right thing in certain circumstances, and so he allows them to freely sin, knowing that ultimately his purposes will be achieved and brought about. So as Joseph said to his brothers when he met them at their reunion in Egypt, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good and has brought this to pass. So I think that with respect to evil acts, God's primary will is not that people would do evil, but his secondary will would be to permit these evil acts, knowing that ultimately his providential purposes will be achieved through them.
I have this may be as a neophyte in this discussion at some set. This is Jeff
Jeff's
again.
learning.
If I get what you're saying is that, okay, God knows all possible scenarios of what every person would do in every situation. And yet so he creates a world where his will is accomplished. But doesn't that mean that God, let's take Hitler, for example. Is that saying that there was no possible world where Hitler would ever respond to God's grace?
No, not at all.
Then why did he?
My view, you slightly misstated it.
Oh, good. I don't want to do that.
In this problem. I didn't say something like God knows every possible world in which creatures would do this and that. That's not the view. There are possible worlds in which no one sins. There are possible worlds in which Hitler becomes a Christian missionary. There are all range of possible worlds available to God, but not all of these worlds are feasible for God because the wrong, and here I'm going to have to use a technical term, the wrong counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are true. It's possible that Hitler, if elected to the presidency of Germany, would turn out to be a nice man. That's possible, but that's not the way it would happen. If he were to be the president of Germany, he would start the Second World War by attacking Poland and all the rest. So the world in which God creates Hitler in exactly those circumstances that he created him in, but in which Hitler turns out to be a nice guy, isn't feasible for God. It's not available for God. So there are possible worlds that aren't feasible for God, given the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom that are contingently true.
Yeah, you'll have to explain the counterfactual, because I'm...
Yeah, all right. Counterfactuals are hypothetical statements in the subjunctive mood. That is to say, they are if-then statements in the subjunctive mood. Now, this is very important and very subtle point, because there's a big difference between conditional statements in the indicative mood and conditional statements in the subjunctive mood. Take the statement, if Oswald didn't shoot Kennedy, somebody else did. Now, that's a conditional in the indicative mood. If Oswald didn't shoot Kennedy, somebody else did. And that's clearly true because Kennedy was shot. So if Oswald didn't shoot him, somebody did. That's a conditional in the indicative mood. But now consider the subjunctive mood of that conditional. If Oswald hadn't shot Kennedy, somebody else would have. Well, that's not at all plausibly true unless you're some conspiracy theorist. If Oswald hadn't shot him, Kennedy probably would have just gone right on and never been assassinated. So although the indicative conditional is true, the subjunctive conditional is not true. And the type of knowledge that God has in middle knowledge is not knowledge of indicative conditionals, it's knowledge of these subjunctive conditionals. If Hitler were elected president, then he would freely invade Poland. And those kinds of subjunctive conditionals, as I said, are contingently true, the ones that are true. So there are possible worlds where Hitler does something else if he's elected president. These are not necessary truths. These are contingent. And so God finds himself confronted, as it were, with this set of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. That is, the counterfactuals about how creatures would freely react. And God's got to work with these. There are all kinds of, an infinite number of possible worlds that aren't available to God because the wrong counterfactuals are true. Is that clear? Does that get the idea?
When you say that he can't deal with it, you mean in order to accomplish the purpose he wants to accomplish, or?
Well, I mean, at all. That there are worlds that are infeasible for God, given that the set of counterfactuals that are true are true. So there isn't a world available to God, for example, in which Hitler is in exactly the same circumstances he was in, and in which he would not freely invade Poland.
But there is a world where Hitler would have never been in that situation.
Right. Yes. Well, and there is a world in which he's in exactly that situation, and he chooses not to invade Poland. But that world isn't available to God. It's not feasible for God because that counterfactual isn't true. The counterfactual that is true is that if Hitler were president, he would invade Poland. The counterfactual, if Hitler were president, he would not invade Poland, is false. And so God can't make the one false and the other one true. He's got to work with the true ones.
This is Jeff again. I guess where my question was going, and I think that helped kind of clear up some of it, is there not a world where is there not a world where everybody would have chosen to follow God?
Yes, there is a possible world like that.
Why wouldn't God
choose that one?
Because it's not feasible for him. The wrong counterfactuals are true. Remember Geisler's point about how this makes God's knowledge contingent? These counterfactuals are not necessarily true. There's a set of them that just happen to be true, and God's got to work with them. And they don't include, perhaps, I mean, for all we know, I'm assuming that if there were such a world, God would have created it, one in which everyone always freely did the right thing. That's not a feasible world for God because those counterfactuals aren't true.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Craig, we have just a few minutes in the first hour. Let me entertain another topic for discussion. I'm surrounded by three physicists here who have great admiration for Einstein. I've heard you give some criticisms, I think, of general relativity. I wonder if you could talk just briefly, obviously a complicated topic, but why are you critical of some of Einstein's thinking?
Because he was a verificationist. Remember at the beginning of this interview, we talked about verificationism and how this dominated philosophy and, frankly, science during the first half of the 20th century. And the idea was that if you can't verify it by your five senses, then it's meaningless. Now, it's impossible to prove through your five senses that something is in uniform motion rather than at absolute rest. There's no experiment that you could perform to show that your reference frame is in absolute uniform motion rather than at absolute rest. And so Einstein concluded from that the notions of absolute rest and absolute motion are meaningless and that they can just be thrown out. And as a result of that, he then developed his special theory of relativity, according to which uniform motion and rest are just relative notions. And to the philosopher of science who lives in a post-verificationist era, one looks back on this and thinks, well, this epistemology is bankrupt. It's simply not true that if something can't be verified, it's meaningless. It's perfectly meaningful, as H.A. Lorentz, the Dutch physicist, saw, to talk about absolute motion and absolute rest, even if these happen to be empirically undetectable to us. So my criticism isn't a scientific one, it's an epistemological and philosophical one. I think that the theory is based upon a defective verificationist epistemology.
So Einstein was a man of his time.
Very much so. He was deeply influenced, as all historians of philosophy who write about the origins of special theory recognize, deeply influenced by Ernst Mach, the positivist German philosopher and scientist. And Mach was an ardent positivist and just hated metaphysics and metaphysical notions like absolute time, absolute space, and absolute motion. And Einstein deeply absorbed this positivistic epistemology of Ernst Mach and brought it to the problems of electrodynamics in his 1905 paper on special relativity. And it's interesting that the great physicists of Einstein's day, his contemporaries like Henri Poincaré and H.A. Lorentz, none of these guys were persuaded that he was correct in denying the existence of absolute time, absolute space, and absolute motion. Lorentz continued to work on relativity theory. He lectured at Caltech into the 20s, I believe, and yet always he said, I still prefer the view that these notions of absolute motion, absolute space and time are meaningful notions and even exist. And he says, I hope that someday we may devise experiments that will reveal these to us. And that is, I think, what we're now starting to see happen in our day.
Well, that's true. I mean, we're now got the instrumental equipment to actually demonstrate whether or not Lorentz was right or Einstein was right. I guess my question, Bill, is does it really make any fundamental difference to you if one of them is right and the other one's wrong?
Well, I think it would make a difference with respect to how you understand God's relationship to time. I'm not suggesting that God's existence or anything is going to stand or fall with this. No, I'm not saying this is something you go to the wall for, or live or die for. But I do think that a lot of the argument for a certain view of God's relationship to time, namely that God is timeless, is predicated upon the truth of Einstein's version of the special theory. And that if that is incorrect, then one of the major props for thinking of God as existing timelessly goes by the wayside. And it does have I think that's the cash value of this, Hugh, is that it will radically affect, I think, your view of time, whether or not time is dynamic and involves process, or whether time is, if you will, sort of space-like, just sort of extended, and the difference between past, present, and future is just an illusion of human consciousness, but that all points in space-time are equally real, and time is a sort of static entity that's just extended in the temporal dimension. And that is going to have some theological implications, I think, that are important. I mean, they're not life or death, but I do think that they are important.
I want to encourage the callers to hang on. You'll get a chance to talk to Dr. Craig, ask him your favorite apologetic question. I also want to let people know that Dr. Craig has a Reasonable Faith monthly newsletter. It's an electronic newsletter at reasonablefaith.org. I get it every month. Great podcasts, great scholarly as well as lay articles. So go on there and get hooked up with all of this great information. My name is Ken Samples, and this is the program where we look at science faith issues. I'm joined in studio by Hugh Ross, Dave Rogstad, and Jeff Swearink, members of our scholar team. And we have a very special guest, Dr. William Lane Craig. I want to remind everybody that you can get on his monthly web newsletter, reasons.org, and there are lots of great podcasts.
No, reasons.org is ours.
Reasonablefaith.org. See, Hugh, I am trying to...
Reasonablefaith.org.
I'm always promoting RTB, Hugh. Remember that when you review me.
You'll get a pay raise.
There you go. I also want to say, Bill, that I think your book, Reasonable Faith, is just a terrific apologetic text. I've just benefited it so much from reading it.
Thanks.
So keep up the good work.
And it's a book we carry here.
We carry it.
Okay.
We sell it here. We're happy to do it.
I also, this is Dave Rogstad. I just want to make the comment, too. I just in this last year read your book. I can't say that it was an easy read, but I loved it. I especially liked the chapter on life without God. I just think that was fantastic, what you called attention to. And I also greatly appreciated your sort of final emphasis on the self-verification of Christianity through the gift of the Holy Spirit. That's such a key point. in our Christian faith.
Good. Well, thank you.
Okay, we're going to go right out to the calls. I want to remind the caller that our guest is Dr. Craig. Maybe you could focus your question, let Dr. Craig take the first whack at it. Maybe one of our scientists might want to add or augment. Let's go out and talk with Joe in Farmville, Virginia. Hi, Joe.
Hey, Mr. Samples. Yes, this is addressed to you, but Dr. Craig, if he's knowledgeable on Augustine, he can answer it also.
Oh, he certainly is.
He is, yes. Go ahead.
Well, this has to do with Augustine's view of the millennium, and I'm sure you know that he said that the millennium is simply the church age. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
He said that the 1,000 years goes by the name of 1,000 years, or that period goes by the name of 1,000 years, and the implication is that it's not really 1,000 years. That's only the name. You agree with that, right?
Dr. Craig, what about Augustine's view of the millennium?
Not done yet.
This would be an amillennial view that would say that the millennium mentioned in the book of Revelation is symbolic or metaphorical. And I have to say that, frankly, I haven't had sufficient interest in this question to explore it in any depth. I think this is one of those issues that's an in-house debate among Christians, and whether you take a premillennial, amillennial, or postmillennial view, I think you can be a faithful Bible-believing Christian and hold to any of those. And so for me, it's really something of a matter of relative indifference. I'm focused on issues that tend to be more in the interface with the secular culture than these in-house debates among Christians. So I don't have any strong views on this.
I haven't asked the question yet.
Okay, well, Joe, go ahead and ask it very concisely.
I didn't mean for a long answer when I said, do you agree? I didn't mean for that to be taken as a question.
Okay,
I was just bringing that as a premise, the warm-up, the background.
Okay, ask your question because we got a lot of calls.
Okay, the idea was that the 1,000 years is longer than 1,000 years because it's not limited to 1,000 because that's simply the name of the period. But the point was that it begins, like Augustine said, if we go by his idea, it began at the first coming of Christ, and it continues to the second coming. Now, what I wanted to bring up was the implications that have been overlooked if he's right. And the idea is that going by that premise that the millennium is a church age, we can understand the destruction at the end of the millennium in terms simply of the much less destruction, much smaller destruction that's mentioned at the end of the church age. And it mentions sudden destruction is going to happen at the time of the rapture. That's in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and 5. Now, my point was, that we can take that sudden destruction there as the meaning of the destruction that's mentioned that's going to happen at the end of the millennium, where it says that the heavens will disappear with a roar and the earth will be burned up. That can simply be interpreted as the sudden destruction, but that's the sideline. Let me get back.
Joe, I gotta cut you off. We got lots of calls. People want to talk to Dr. Craig. Eschatology is an important area, but it is a disputed area. Augustine represented really kind of the foundation of the amillennial view, though there are people who think that he may have been somewhat postmillennial. If I can answer what I think was your question, amillennialists do believe in a tribulation period toward the end, a literal antichrist, but rather than a premillennial scenario, they see the millennial age as being that period of time between Christ's first and second advent. So some good books out there on amillennialism. Anthony Hoekema's book, The Bible in the Future, will be helpful, but we got to go to other calls. We've got lots of them on the line. Let's go out to Ronnie in Evansville, Indiana. Hi, Ronnie.
How you doing?
You're talking to Dr. William Lane Craig.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Ross can add to this if he wants to. I appreciate any input he might have.
Go ahead.
Okay, my question is, when Jesus died, he had his flesh and bone body when he's resurrected. He went back to heaven when he ascended. Okay? Well, what I learned from Dr. Ross is that the transcendence of God, heaven goes beyond the physical realms of this universe. Well, and we're not, where did Jesus' body go? I mean, where is he at? I mean, he has this physical body that he died in, and now he's in heaven, and I know he comes back and forth to earth, to heaven, but why did he get to hold on to his body? I know it's a weird question, but why did he... I mean, it kind of gives us a picture of what heaven's like his body, of course, transported from heaven to earth and back and forth. What was the purpose in that, sir, of him keeping his actual flesh and bone body, and we have similar bodies?
Well, Ronnie, this is Hugh speaking. Let me set our friend Bill Craig up. Paul talks about two different kinds of physical bodies. So, Bill, take it away.
Well, what I was going to say was, in terms of your final question that you were asking, I think that the fact that Christ is resurrected and takes his body into the eternal state is an affirmation of the goodness of the human body and of materiality as part of our human nature. It's the most decisive affirmation of the value of human corporeality, the worth of the body, against Gnosticism and views that would depreciate the body, that we can imagine that the second person of the Trinity would be embodied for eternity in his human nature. The human nature of Christ is not something he just had for 30 years and then discarded like a husk. He carries his human nature into eternity. Now, I took it that the thrust of your question was, where is it now? That's a good philosophical question. Let me just give a possible answer that I've toyed with and see what you think of this.
Okay.
Suppose that Christ's human body, or that his human nature is manifested as a physical body only when Christ is in space and time. But the ascension represents Christ exiting space-time, so that even though he has a human nature during this interim period, but prior to his return, his human body isn't manifested anywhere. It doesn't appear any place because he's not in space and time. And an analogy I could think of would be a tuning fork that is vibrating and producing a hum. And if you put that tuning fork inside of a vacuum jar, it's still vibrating. The fork hasn't changed, but there's no sound anymore because there's no medium to convey the vibrations. Now, couldn't it be like that with Christ's human nature? When Christ exits this space-time continuum, he still has a human nature, but it doesn't manifest itself as a physical body. But when he comes again, when he returns to our space-time continuum, then his personal fleshly body will be manifested again. So that would be my best take on the question of where is his human body now. It's just not manifested because he's not in space-time.
Bill, this is Hugh. Do you consider that we're going to have physical bodies when we're in the new creation?
Yes. Oh, yeah. I think that the Christian hope is not immortality of the soul, but it's resurrection of the body.
And how does that square with your views of space and time?
Well, I think that there will be a new heavens and a new earth, so that we will have a spatial and temporal, corporeal experience. And in that sense, I think that Ronnie was a little bit mistaken in talking about Christ has gone to heaven. In one sense, I think we all understand what he means, but it's not heaven in the final sense. When we go to heaven after the resurrection, we will be in a space-time world, a new heavens and a new earth that will be a physical world where we have bodies.
Would it be a different kind of space-time than what we experience now?
Well, I think it would have different laws of nature, don't you? Because Christ's resurrection body had the ability to do things that were beyond the bounds of what our natural human bodies will do. These will be immortal, powerful, spirit-dominated bodies that will no longer be subject to decay and corruption and death. So I think there'll be different laws of nature in that new heavens and new earth.
Well, I would agree with that, Bill, but I think it's more than that the dimensions are radically different than the dimensions we experience right now. What do you think?
Well, I can't see that they would be essentially different in that they would still be, I assume, 3 spatial dimensions. I suppose there could be more. And then time, seems to me that time is sort of essentially the way it is. I can't imagine what it would be like to have a different sort of time. And at least I don't see any grounds for thinking that. I think as long as the laws of nature are different, that you could have time and space that would be similar to what we have now, unless you can think of some good reason to think otherwise. I'm open to that.
Well, it would be a fun debate, but we want to get back to the callers.
Okay, Ronnie, thank you for that call. Let's move ahead. Lots of callers on the line. If you want to talk to Dr. Craig, call in, get in the queue. Let's go out and talk to Ed from Des Moines, Iowa. Hi, Ed.
Hello, Dr. Samples.
You're talking with Dr. Craig.
Yeah, I'm going to change my question because I forgot he was going to be on today.
Okay.
I just want to thank him, first of all, because I was at the debate he had with Dr. Avalos in Ames, Iowa, and I'd like to for providing a very good Christian witness. That was very, very effective. And I recently read a book that had more of a philosophical bent to it, and I was wondering if he could get his thoughts on the 2 arguments presented. And I don't think these are this author's his arguments. I think he was quoting somebody, but I can't remember exactly who he was quoting. He basically gave the answer that something can't change itself and something cannot give what it does not have. And he used that as 2 first principles for the existence of God. Your thoughts?
Yeah, those are fairly traditional medieval principles, but I'm not persuaded, at least, that the first one is true, because it does seem to me that free agents are able to change themselves. The idea of freedom of the will entails that we can do things spontaneously that don't have antecedent determining causes.
Okay, well, Ed, thank you for that question and appreciate your support of Reasons to Believe. Let's go out here and talk with Roger calling from Portland, Maine. Hi, Roger. You're on with Dr. William Lane Craig. Did I push the wrong button there?
Yeah, now you got him.
There he's on. Go ahead, Roger.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I have 2 questions if you have time for both of them. But anyway, and the first one is, Dr. Craig, in the first hour, I believe that you essentially said that there's no world available to God in which Hitler was in exactly the situation he was in and where he didn't start World War II, or you said something very close to that.
Right.
And my obvious question is, then why did God create Hitler at all, or why didn't he create Hitler at another time or in another situation?
Well, because God has morally sufficient reasons for allowing the Second World War to occur. He knows that ultimately, in the long plan of history, this will redound to the achievement of his purposes, which are to establish the kingdom of God and to bring as many people freely into the kingdom as possible.
So basically what you're saying is that God at times will choose to use extreme evil in order to accomplish ultimate good.
Absolutely. I am absolutely saying that. And I think that the idea that God is some sort of a domesticated Santa Claus up in the sky is a really false image of God. When you read the Old Testament, for example, and some of the prophets, God will say things like, I brought famine upon you. I brought disaster upon you. I brought lean years upon you, and still you did not repent and turn to me. It's very clear that God was allowing these things to happen to the people with a view toward bringing them to repentance and a knowledge of himself.
Right.
So all of these evils and things that occur in the world, I think, are ultimately within the providential plan of God. It's not as though God is asleep at the switch or he's impotent to stop these things if he wanted to, but I think that in his providence, he knows what evils and sufferings to permit with a view toward his purposes being ultimately accomplished. And that may be a scary view of God in some ways, but as C.S. Lewis, I think, aptly reminded us, Aslan is not a tame lion.
Right.
This
Right,
Dave
and that's very accurate to the Old
Just a
Testament.
quick comment from Dave Rogstad here. When we were talking about this earlier, Dr. Craig, it seems like what you've added here as different from what seemed to come across earlier, and that is that God's final choice as to what to create is not determined simply by counterfactuals, by what is possible and what isn't possible, but also in the desire to accomplish some purpose. That he's
Certainly. Now, again, with respect to these counterfactuals, it's not a matter of what's possible or not. Remember,
Yeah, I've used the wrong
anything
term
that's
there.
logically possible is possible. It's a matter of what's feasible for
Feasible,
God,
that
given
was-
these counterfactual truths. And the question will be, well, why did God create these people in these circumstances when he could have created other people in other circumstances? And surely the answer to that has to do in some way with God's ultimate desire of establishing his kingdom and bringing men
Exactly.
and women freely into a knowledge of himself with the great plan of salvation. So that would be the sort of overriding
right.
plan for human history that would prompt God to create some persons in some circumstances rather than others.
Right. That didn't come to me. It didn't come across as clearly
Yeah.
in the first hour
Yeah.
as you're saying it now.
Okay.
Roger, go ahead with your second question.
Okay. My second question is, since atheists say that we are just animals and therefore that any morality is permissible according to convenience or preference, then how do atheists explain the existence of objective moral values and duties?
That's a great question, and it does seem to expose a kind of inconsistency in them. If you look at Richard Dawkins' book, for example, he says there is no good, there is no evil, there's nothing but pointless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA, and that's all. And yet at the same time, Dawkins is an undying moralist, condemning homophobia, religious indoctrination of children. He condemns the Amish. He even promulgates his own 10 Commandments. And it seems to me that there's just a deep, deep inconsistency there between the naturalistic worldview, which seems to suggest that moral values and duties are just the spin-offs of the sociobiological evolutionary process, and our deep grasp of the intrinsic value of human beings and our moral obligations and prohibitions. And on the atheistic view, they pretty much just have to say, I just believe in these things and that's all. Michael Roos, for example, who is a evolutionary philosopher of science, he says ethics works and I believe in it. And that's the end of the story.
So atheists, therefore, have no significant logical basis by which they say evolution brought about objective moral values and duties.
Well, no, because that is self-contradictory. If you say that evolution brought them about, that is to say that they are not objective moral values and duties. If you had different initial conditions or different evolutionary pathways, different values and duties would have been brought about. So these aren't objective in the sense that they would be valid and binding in all possible situations.
So they have no answer.
Well, I don't think so. They typically will simply affirm the value of human beings and say, we grasp that human beings are valuable, we grasp that it's wrong to hurt people for no good reason, and that's the end of the discussion. You just stubbornly affirm these moral truths.
Even though it undermines their paradigm, basically.
Well, I think it does. I want to have an explanation for those moral truths that we grasp. I think we can agree, yes, we all do grasp the intrinsic value of human persons and that we have certain moral obligations and prohibitions, but I want to know why, and especially why on a naturalistic view. I mean, chimpanzees don't have moral obligations and prohibitions, and according to the naturalistic view, we're just slightly more advanced primates than they are. So why is it that we're invested with these strange moral duties and prohibitions? Where do they come from? And I don't see a good answer on naturalism for those questions.
Right.
Okay, Roger, thank you. Terrific questions. Let's take another call. We have Rob calling from Boulder, Colorado. Hi, Rob. You're on with Dr. William Lane Craig.
Okay, my question has to deal with the day-age interpretation, and more specifically the seventh day or the seventh age that RTB says we're in. And I'm also specifically talking about Hebrews chapter 4, verses 1 through 11. And in that verse, they talk about the seventh day and entering the rest. I was wondering how other interpretations from RTB, different from RTB, interpret that. That's my question.
Boy, that sounds more in your bailiwick, Hugh.
Well, it probably is, but I'd be interested in what you'd have to say about it.
Well, I guess I would say this, that the use of the Sabbath principle in Hebrews and elsewhere is clearly referring to a literal day of the week that would be set aside for worship. But that doesn't mean that a literal day cannot be used as a literary metaphor for something else. So, for example, take the word arm. The word arm can mean a limb of your body that has a hand attached to it. That's an arm. But an arm can also be used metaphorically to indicate a weapon. It's when we talk about somebody that's carrying a concealed arm or something. That would be a metaphorical use of the word arm as a weapon. Now, in Genesis 1, it's not using the word day to indicate something other than a day. It is talking about a day. But that doesn't answer the question as to whether or not this couldn't be a literary metaphor that doesn't indicate a 24-hour period of time. So it seems to me that it is talking about days, but that doesn't close the literary question as to whether or not these days aren't used as literary devices for something metaphorical.
Well, Rob, this is Hugh again. There's a real value in looking at the days of creation in Genesis 1 as long periods of time, with the first 6 days bracketed by an evening and a morning. You notice the text does not bracket the seventh day. There is no evening and morning for the seventh day, which would imply, and I think Hebrews 4 would support this, that we're still in the seventh day. And it's a day when God does not create. He doesn't create, physical things. He's obviously performing miracles in the spirit realm.
Well, in redemption.
Exactly. I mean, that's what Jesus said in John 5, that he and his Father are still performing miracles even though they're in a current state of rest. They're resting from the work of creation. But therein gives us an apologetic tool. In other words, what we see from the Bible is that God was active in his creation miracles before he created Adam and Eve. He's not active now. Therefore, from that kind of a biblical perspective, we would predict a very different nature in the physical world today than we would in the past, which allows us to develop scientific tests. And this is the kind of thing that Fuzz and I and others here at Reasons to Believe have been talking about, is we really do see a difference in the record of nature before humanity than what we see after humanity, particularly as it applies to speciation and extinction. In fact, we were talking a few weeks ago about an elegant experiment done with E. coli bacteria. An interesting thing there is you're doing the experiment under strictly natural conditions, and yet when you try to explain what we see in the fossil record, we realize that there's an incongruity there, therefore there must be a supernatural intervention. So this is an example of where your theology on the days of creation can have significant consequences for how you do your apologetics. But just to back up what Bill is saying, when you look at that Hebrew word for day, the word yom, it's got 4 different literal definitions. So you don't even have to get into this figurative, metaphorical thing. The definition itself has as one of its literal meanings a long but finite period of time. And I think it's also important to point out that in biblical Hebrew as opposed to modern Hebrew, there is no word for a long period of time except for the word yom. So in that sense, I think we have a mandate to go through the whole of the Bible and say, of the 4 different literal definitions, which one is consistent with everything the Bible teaches, and then try to develop apologetics applications from that.
Rob, this is Ken Samples. It is interesting among people who kind of come under the umbrella of old earth creationism. Some adopt a day-age interpretation, as Dr. Ross has articulated. There are people, however, who embrace the framework interpretation, and then others who hold an analogical day. So just as the work days that we would find in the Pentateuch, God has his work days, and there's a type of analogy that is taking place. Now, all of this, of course, is very different than the calendar day view that says there's 6 consecutive 24-hour periods. So lots of discussion as to what the days of creation mean and how they can be appropriately used. Rob, thanks for that great question. Dave?
Yeah, we're waiting here for some phone calls to come in. I want to stick in a question for Craig, Dr. Craig. Again, reflecting or commenting on my conversations with my atheist friend at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, we on occasion have gotten into the subject of hell and eternal punishment, and why is it necessary for the minor sins that we commit here on this earth to have to suffer for eternity? And that was a whole area of discussion, and it's hard to talk about these things.
Yeah.
But in the course of it, we also talked about Christ having died for our sins, and him being able to suffer for 3 days and take care of all the sins of the world. And in the course of it, he was not at all impressed with the idea that if Christ is really God, what's the big deal that he happened to spend 3 days dead in some sense or another? He's God after all. What's the big deal about this? And I'd just be curious to know how you would respond to this. I'm sure you've probably run up against these kinds of comments before.
Well, the question I usually get is, how could God give an infinite punishment for a finite amount of sin that is incommensurate? And with respect to that, I think there are 2 possible ways to answer, and maybe it would relate to your second question. One way to answer that would be to say, well, every finite sin does get only a finite amount of punishment, but the damned in hell continue to sin insofar as they continue to hate and reject God.
Mm-hmm.
When you read the book of Revelation, the impression you get is that those who are under God's judgment are not repentant and sorry for what they've done. Instead, they hate God all the more for what he's doing to them and for the punishment he inflicts upon them. And if that's the case, then hell is literally self-perpetuating, because the sinning goes on forever, the punishment would go on forever, and therefore each sin does get a finite punishment, but because the sinning never stops, the punishment never stops. The second way, I think, though, to answer it, and would be the one I think I would prefer, would be to say that in a sense hell is not a punishment for the sins of finite consequence that we commit, like adultery and theft and lying and murder and so forth. That those things, as bad as they are, deserve only a finite punishment. Rather, what hell is really the punishment for is for the rejection of God himself. And this is a sin of infinite gravity and proportion that does deserve an infinite punishment, because it is the creature spitting in the face of his creator and turning his back on him and saying, I have no need of you, I don't want you. And I think that is a sin of infinite seriousness that could merit eternal punishment. Now, maybe in the same way, the dignity of Christ's person, being God, dying for our sins and becoming the sin bearer, wouldn't require the prolongation of his punishment because of who he was, because of the dignity of his person. And so he bore the wrath of God upon him for us in that brief period of time that would be similar to what would be extended over infinity for finite human beings.
Why don't you think God, in the end, just doesn't annihilate the people in hell rather than allowing them to just continue in this process?
Well, maybe the reason is because they have committed a sin of infinite gravity and proportion, and that to annihilate them would be unjust because they would not get the punishment that they deserve. Indeed, I can think of lots of unbelievers who would be delighted to know that they're going to be annihilated by God and get away with everything they've done, after just maybe a finite punishment. So it may well be that my second answer is the one that, even the first answer would require them to be perpetuated, because if God just annihilated them, they wouldn't be punished for their sins. So I think that it may be that justice has to be done, and annihilation would not serve the purposes of justice.
Dr. Craig, you've written extensively about time and God's relationship to time. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you argue something like this, that without the universe, God is timeless. With the universe, he is timeful. Yes. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, yeah, I think that there are good reasons to think that time is finite in the past and had a beginning, but that God did not have a beginning. So how can you make sense of that? Well, it seems to me you have to say that God transcends time, that God existing alone without the universe exists in a timeless state. When he creates the universe, however, then time comes into being. And in virtue of being really related to the universe, God would be drawn into time because of his changing relations with the world. For example, when the universe comes into being, God stands in a relationship in which he never stood before, namely the relationship of coexisting with the universe, or the relationship of sustaining the universe in being. And in virtue of that change, God would be drawn into time at that moment. So it seems to me that it makes sense to say that God exists timelessly when he's all by himself and there is no space or time, no creation, but that the moment that time and space begin, God then enters into time because of the real relations he sustains with the universe.
But you just used a word that indicates that he's in time in that previous state. You said the moment that he creates.
Right, but
what
that
is
wasn't the previous state. That is the moment of creation. So I would say that the moment of creation is the moment at which time begins and is the moment that God enters into time. What I did not say was that God existed before that moment, or that when he was alone or something of that sort. I tried to avoid using any temporal words like that so as to not contradict myself.
Mm-hmm. Now, there are theologians and philosophers these days that get a little tense when the classical philosophers and theologians talk about God being timeless, and they suggest God is everlasting. Mm-hmm. What is there a place in which a classical view of God's timelessness creates tension, or are some of these people who want to reject timelessness, are they on troubled ground?
Well, Ken, this is Hugh. Let me try to get a clarification from Bill, because I remember you saying earlier, Bill, that you believe in the new creation. Uh-huh. There will be some kind of dimensionality that would be somewhat akin to temporality and spatiality.
Yeah, I was even stronger than that. I said it would be
right.
Temporality and spatiality.
Well, doesn't that lead to a bit of a problem? I mean, you got God creating space and time when he creates the universe.
Right.
And there's going to come a time when the universe will no longer exist. You know, and in physics, the laws of physics are intimately wrapped up into the space-time dimensionality. So wouldn't that indicate that there had to be some kind of different kind of space-time dimensionality in a new creation? If that is the case, isn't time a lot more complicated than what some of our discussion has been suggesting?
Yeah. Well, you see, I don't identify time with that quantity that goes under that name in physics. I think that what physics discusses are our measures of time, but the time is quite independent of these physical quantities. So, for example, I could well imagine God creating angelic realms temporally prior to his creation of the physical universe. and there would be angels that would have, say, a mental succession of events in their minds. And I think these would be, therefore, in time, because if you have a succession of events, even mental events, you have time. But it wouldn't be any kind of time that would be measured by physics, because there wouldn't be any spatial, physical reality. So I think that it's quite meaningful to talk about a kind of time that would be a metaphysical time. And in that sort of time, God's destruction of this physical universe and creation of a new heavens and a new earth would be after the present universe in this sort of metaphysical time. So even if there's a vast physical transformation, it will occur after, temporally after, later than what we have now, and in that sense is still related to it in this sort of metaphysical time.
So you're making a distinction between cosmic time and metaphysical time. Is cosmic time a subset of metaphysical time, or is it something completely independent?
Well, insofar as we're talking about time as it plays a role in the general theory of relativity, the cosmic time that measures the duration of the universe, I think, again, that what that is, it's a measure of this metaphysical time since the moment of creation. I think the universe is God's clock. It literally is God's clock by which it measures the duration of absolute time or metaphysical time from the moment of creation. And if the clock is destroyed, obviously the measure of time would be destroyed. But that doesn't mean that time itself couldn't continue to go on. In fact, I think it will go on, because God will be creating a new heavens and a new earth that will be inhabited by resurrected people and so forth, and that will occur later than what we have now. So I would say there is a coincidence, if you will, between cosmic time and metaphysical time right now, because cosmic time is the physical measure of God's time, is the way I put it.
So you don't see these as separate time dimensions?
No, I don't. No, I would see it rather as a clock measurement of time.
So you'd have cosmic time as what, some small subset of metaphysical time, and then how does that fit with your concept of timelessness?
Well, what I would say is that for the sake of simplicity, we can say that metaphysical time began at the Big Bang, at the moment of creation. We have no reason to think that God was active and doing things prior to creation. There's nothing that I find in the Bible that says he created the angelic realms prior to the creation of the physical universe. So
it doesn't rule it out either, though, right?
Simplicity, we can say that physical time and metaphysical time both began at the moment of creation.
That's assuming that the angels were not created before the universe.
Yeah, that's on that assumption.
Right.
Yes.
Dr. Craig, let me ask you a question about arguing for God's existence. I'm kind of fond of the idea of maybe approaching an argument for God's existence in kind of an abductive way. I think God...
By that you mean?
An inference to the best explanation. I see the singularity of the beginning of the universe, its fine-tuning, objective moral values, abstract entities like logic and universals, that God is the best explanation of all of that phenomena. I wonder what you think the best argument for God would be.
Wow. Well, I agree with you that we should present a cumulative case. I don't think that we want to take the arguments in isolation from one another. The way I think of the arguments for God's existence is not like a chain where the chain is only as strong as the weakest link. Rather, I think of it like a coat of chain mail where the links all reinforce one another, and the coat of mail is not as weak as the weakest link. Rather, it can be quite strong even if there are weak links in it. So I like your approach of having this cumulative case that you say God is the best explanation of all these various factors. But I don't see that as inconsistent with giving deductive arguments like I do when you consider each factor in isolation. It seems to me that as building your cumulative case, you're still going to have to talk about, well, for example, what is the best explanation of the fine-tuning? Is it chance? Is it necessity or is it design? And you're going to have to reason exactly the same way when I put the arguments in deductive form. So I don't see that the form of the arguments is all that big a deal. We both would agree that it's a cumulative case, I think.
Right. Well, let's tackle a topic that my colleague Jeff Swearink is very interested in. Much discussion about Big Bang cosmology and particularly the fine-tuning in the universe is responded to by some of the naturalists by saying, maybe there's a whole ensemble of universes, something called multiverse. We've kicked this idea around, and in our lectures we critique the multiverse. My colleague Jeff Swearink would say, well, is it possible that the multiverse could be consistent with a Christian worldview? We also wonder, however, if some of these cosmologists are kind of looking for loopholes and those kinds of things. So I wonder what you think about that, and I encourage, Jeff, you to jump in on this topic.
Yeah. Well, I think that the multiverse hypothesis is a sort of backhanded compliment to the power of the argument for design, because otherwise sober scientists would not be flocking to an alternative so metaphysical and so far removed from empirical reality as the idea that there's an infinite number of randomly ordered universes out there that we can't empirically detect, unless they felt driven to that alternative because the chance hypothesis and the physical necessity hypothesis just don't seem to cut the mustard in comparison with the design hypothesis. So I think it's really something in a sense we can welcome, because it really does testify to the power of the design hypothesis. Now, that being said, however, I think there really are some serious problems with it that need to be discussed. One of these is that the hypothesis has got to have some kind of a mechanism for generating an infinite number of randomly ordered worlds. And yet we don't really have, I think, in current science, any sort of an adequate account of what that mechanism might be. I notice that, for example, in the current discussions of the inflationary multiverse, that this sort of model of the universe cannot be extended infinitely into the past. You have to come to a past boundary. Now, what that suggests, then, is that if there is a mechanism that is generating these bubbles of true vacuum within this expanding false vacuum, that this has only been going on for a finite amount of time. And therefore, how can we know, or what confidence can we have, that there would be by now an infinite number of these things and that they would be randomly ordered? It might well be the case that there are only a finite number of these bubble universes and that there aren't sufficient number to guarantee the appearance by chance alone of a finely tuned universe. And I noticed in his book, Many Worlds in One, that Alexander Vilenkin wrote last year, that the way he generates his infinite multitude of universes is by turning time into space and treating universes, bubble universes, which lie in the future on our same plane of simultaneity so as to make them exist now. In other words, he turns the infinite future into an infinite set of simultaneously existing universes. And I think that's just illegitimate. If these things exist in the cosmic future, they don't exist yet. They're unreal, and it's quite illegitimate to treat these things as though they were simultaneously existing universes right now. So I think that's an initial problem, is that is generating this infinite ensemble. The other thing that you run into that I talk about in Reasonable Faith is that this explanation faces the same problem that Ludwig Boltzmann faced when he tried to explain why the universe is currently in a disequilibrium state if it has existed from eternity. He said maybe the universe as a whole is in a state of equilibrium, but by chance alone there will be pockets of disequilibrium that will appear here and there in the sea of equilibrium. And he called these little pockets worlds and said, we're just one of these worlds of disequilibrium in this overall ocean of equilibrium. Well, the problem that Boltzmann's hypothesis faced that finally sank it was that if that is the case, then it is vastly, vastly more probable that we should be observing a much smaller universe than the one we observe, because a much tinier fluctuation from equilibrium would be sufficient for our existence than the vast universe that we see. And exactly a parallel problem faces the many-worlds hypothesis for getting rid of the fine-tuning, as Roger Penrose has pointed out. It's vastly more probable if our universe is just a member of a randomly ordered infinite ensemble of universes that we would be observing a much smaller universe that is sufficient for our existence than the vast universe that we actually see. In fact, this has brought into the discussion what one theorist has called the invasion of the Boltzmann brains, because the smallest universe that we could observe would be a universe in which a single brain fluctuates into existence with the illusion of an external world and a universe wider than itself. And these sorts of worlds are simply much more plenteous in the world ensemble than worlds of normally behaved observers like us. So that if we are just a random member of a randomly ordered infinite world ensemble, each one of us should conclude that solipsism is true, that we're just a Boltzmann brain, and that all the rest of the universe, our body and everything else, is all an illusion of our own brain, which is absurd. So this is where the debate is today. This whole question of the Boltzmann brains and the problem of what is a typical observer is right on the cutting edge of the discussion of fine-tuning today.
You know, that's one of the things that strikes me is that, you know, you start looking at the multiverse, and you know, once you kind of understand what the multiverse is actually advocating, that it seems to be a great blow to both the design and the cosmological argument, the teleological and cosmological argument, because maybe this has infinitely existed, or it's existed forever, and if there's just enough of it, we're going to be where we can be. I mean, it seems to explain all of the fine tuning. But as you look into the details, lo and behold, you still end up, I think, with a much stronger case for a beginning, because now where Big Bang cosmology and the Hawking-Penrose theorems rely on general relativity, now you've taken a bunch of exceptions, and all of those exceptions still have a beginning. And so the beginning is a far more robust case. And when you look into the details, you have lots of places where the design is showing up again in ways that I think maybe even as we understand them more fully are going to be more powerful evidence for design. And so I find the multiverse very interesting in that vein.
Yeah, and I do want to second your comment that was made earlier that there's nothing inconsistent with a multiverse and theism. In fact, I think theism is really the only hope for the multiverse hypothesis, because on naturalism, as I say, it's highly, highly probable that we don't inhabit a multiverse. So that if you want to believe in a multiverse, your best bet would be, I think, to believe in God and believe that He created it and specially placed us here. But apart from theism, it's very hard to see how a multiverse hypothesis can be probable.
Yeah.
Well, we've only got a little bit of time left, and Bill, I wanted to give you a chance to clarify a comment you made earlier about middle knowledge.
Okay.
And it seemed like you were implying in one part of your conversation that God is in total control of everything that happens in the future, but He exercises that control exclusively through controlling the circumstances, not the human will. Is that accurate, or do you kind of see God having some influence both on the will side and the circumstances side?
Well, when one speaks of circumstances, Hugh, one mustn't forget that this also includes the circumstances of God's own actions, His convicting power of the Holy Spirit, His drawing people to Himself, His miraculous acts in history. So that when one speaks of the circumstances, you're not only talking about external physical events, but you're talking about all of that, all of those acts of grace and ministrations of the Holy Spirit to which God knows people will freely respond in this or that way. So don't misunderstand me when I speak of circumstances to mean just sort of physical events. This includes all of the circumstances that include God's acts of grace and gifts of grace and work of the Holy Spirit and all of the rest. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that helps. In other words, God's will is there influencing my will. He brings people into my circumstances who have persuasive arguments that affect my will.
And He convicts you of sin. He speaks to your heart through the Holy Spirit.
That's
All
where I
those
think
would
you're
be
getting
part
to
of the
something important.
circumstances.
In other words, that God actually does directly influence my will through what you're describing.
His grace.
His grace,
Yes,
His
in the same
conviction.
way that I influence your will. You know, when I talk to you and interact with you, I'm trying to influence your will, and I think God does that. What I would deny is that He does this irresistibly. That's where I would part company with our Reformed brethren, is that this is a unilateral influence of God upon the will that is irresistible.
And that's the Wesleyan tradition.
Right.
Yeah.
In fact, the Wesleyan tradition is an Arminian tradition.
Right.
And when you look historically, Jacob Arminius was a Molinist. He was the portal through which Molinism entered Protestant theology.
Okay, Dr. Craig, it's been a pleasure to have you. I know we made you work for 2 hours, but...
Well, I've enjoyed being with so august a panel. I've never had such an interview before in my life.
Well, hey, your work is very important to us. We carry a couple of your books. I want to recommend everybody go on reasonablefaith.org. Get a hold of the great apologetic book, Reasonable Faith. And Dr. Craig, I want to encourage you to keep up the good work. I hope you'll come back. We talk about a lot of these issues at lunch, and your name is brought up. So thanks again for being with us today.
Well, it's been my privilege, and I want to wish all the best to you too, Hugh, and the work of Reasons to Believe. Keep up the good work.
Thank you for listening to Creation Update. Next week, no show, but we'll be back the following week.
This has been a presentation of the Ministry of Reasons to Believe. If you would like to know more about other resources offered by Reasons to Believe, or have questions about issues related to science and the Christian faith, please visit our website at reasons.org or call us toll-free at 800-482-7836.